I'm Gary Richard Arnold, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Ronald Wilson Reagan and the fact that he's been used as an icon for the conservative Republicans and conservative independents for years. And I've got a special relationship with Ronald Reagan in the fact that in 1966, when I was in my mid-20s, I ran for state assembly in a contested race. And that was the same year Ronald Reagan was running for the governor of the state of California. A year or two earlier, he gave a speech called "The Time for Choosing," which was terrific. It was right on. And for that reason, I ignored the rumors that I had heard about Ronald Reagan and endorsed him for governor. And sadly, I found out that once he became governor, he did the exact opposite of what he had promised the people. He put in the first gun laws, the Mulford Act. He did the executive orders by regionalizing the state of California. He supported with the ex-Governor Brown the changing of the state constitution, which allowed regional developments of AMBAG and ABAG and SCAG, which are trans-government operations from counties and cities throughout the state of California. And this fit into an earlier plan that was driven by Nelson Rockefeller in a book called The New Federalism. When I looked deeper into Ronald Reagan, I wasn't the only one that was snowed. There was Anthony Hilder that gave him a break on this run for governor. He thought maybe he changed. People can and do change, and we all pray for that. But he had sponsored an album by Myron Fagan, who's famous both in Broadway, silent movies, and in the talkies. And he put together a record called Red Stars. And in Red Stars, there was Ronald Wilson Reagan as one of the Red Stars. And a lot of people don't know that, but he was involved in some pretty heavy-duty items. During the time when China was in contest between communist Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, Reagan joined an outfit called the Citizens for a Far Eastern Policy, and that was designated as communist, and his name is right here in an article about that. Some of the people that were involved with that included Agnes Smidley, who was involved with the Sword spy ring, one of the most successful spy rings in history, in all of history. There was Hugh DeLacy, who was a communist organizer, and that California Senate fact-finding committee said he switched and turned at every switch of Soviet policy. He was an organizer also in Santa Cruz. There's an interesting connection with the Santa Cruz nexus there in the fact that Leon Panetta was in contact with Hugh DeLacy, in fact honored this communist organizer at the Loudon Nelson Center in Santa Cruz. And because Leon Panetta actually was campaigning for Nelson Rockefeller because of his book called The New Federalism in the early 60s. And he went to the White House with Richard Nixon and was part of the Kissinger team to get Nixon out and to get Nelson Rockefeller made president. They got as far as having Gerald Ford, Bilderberger, appointing Nelson Rockefeller as vice president of the United States. But anyway, back to Ronald Reagan and his support of, communist Mao. We also find that Reagan belonged to the let me do a little bit more on the Committee for a Democratic Far Eastern Policy. There's a few other names you should know besides Hugh DeLacy. Another name with this group is Herbert Apteker, and he was the theoretician of the American Communist Party. Victor Perlo was connected with one of the Soviet spy rings out of Washington, D.C. I already mentioned Agnes Smidley. There's scores of others that would just add on names, but let it be known that Ronald Reagan helped the communists and helped Red China, or Communist China, become communist. And as David Rockefeller said, Mao's taking over of communist China was one of the greatest experiments ever. And you can find Rockefeller's quote in there. And of course, it involved killing 80 million of their own people. But that never stuck to Ronald Reagan. Reagan also belonged to the American Veterans Committee. And again, according to the California Senate Un-American Activities Report, it says that the American Veterans Committee primarily preliminary reports indicate that the group was under communist influence. And Reagan belonged to both the local and the national organization. And he was pushed. He saw that Reagan could be used. He sponsored one of the more active positions Ronald Reagan took was for the Mobilization for Democracy. They put on a series on TV, a 13 series played on KLAC, and it was considered subversive by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Once again, the California State Senate said the committee has reported communist as a communist front, and that it was dependent upon their secret loyalty to the Soviet Union. So we're talking about Ronald Reagan, and you'll see an album cover that talks about red stars over Hollywood, and Ronald Reagan was one of them. It turns out that later in 46 and 47, when the CIA was being formed, that he was picked up as a potential for the power elite. And his handler was a man by the name of Cord Meyer. Cord Meyer went to a school of a grouping in New England called the 10 Schools Admission Organization. These are schools, prep schools, that filter people into secret societies. The 10 Schools Admission Organization is a series of prep schools in New England, and what they do is they funnel people into secret societies or into positions for global control for a global world government. And Cord Meyer went to one of those schools, and he belonged to one of those secret societies at Yale that Dr. Anthony Sutton revealed, one of them which is Skull and Bones. He was Ronald Reagan's handler. In fact, he was the head of the United World Federalists, which obviously pushes for a world government. And Ronald Reagan, of course, was right along with them, and he was on the letterhead for the United World Federalists for over 13 years. We find also that he was part of the World Peace Through Law. And again, if you understand this globalistic mindset of Ronald Reagan, you'll understand what he did, not what he said. Just as the cult followers of Obama isn't doing what he said about getting the closing Guantanamo or doing a lot of other sensible things about being transparent, etc. But we find some of the people that Ronald Reagan is associated with on this World Peace Through Law. We find Alan Cranston, who was a founding member of Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. We find Norman Cousins, who was also a head of the United World Federalists for a while. We find Robert M. Hutchins. Robert M. Hutchins was the head of the Ford Foundation's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. They had written a new constitution to replace the one that we presently have. In fact, the man that wrote a world constitution was one of his hirees at the Center for the Democratic Study of, for the Center for Democratic Institutions. We also find on here Dory Sherry, who was the head of the ADL, which is hardcore left, attacking people that were concerned about communist activity and the diminishing of our constitutional rights. But that was Ronald Reagan's entry into politics. He was picked up on television to give him a popular venue by General Electric. He was given a TV series, and General Electric picked him up and sent him around the countries giving a tailored speech talking about free enterprise. Again, if people go back to American secret establishment, they look up General Electric, they look up the financing behind the Bolshevik Revolution and the financing of Hitler, they'll find that General Electric was right in there at an address at 120 Broadway, which repeatedly comes up in any researcher's historical treatment of an investigation of secret societies and the World War I and World War II, and the funding of both of our enemies, the communists in the Soviet Union and Hitler in Germany. So Reagan got this wholesome, all-American treatment by traveling the country, giving his speech a time for choosing, and running successfully for governor. And from the governor's cat seat, he used that to hurt California and set it back. He got as I mentioned earlier, he got the regionalization going, he got the gun laws going. He increased the taxes, which was the highest California had ever had. But in years later, he ran for the United States president. At that time, myself and other people knew of his skullduggery, so we were not supporting him, but we were involved with the Republican Party and went to Detroit during the convention that he was nominated at. And at that convention, everybody was thinking, he promised that he would not appoint anybody that didn't follow his philosophy. He attacked Billy Carter because of his appointment of members of the CFR and Trilateral Commission, both in New Hampshire and Florida, and said he wouldn't do that. Yet his very transition committee, which he had already appointed before the convention, about 80% of them were members of the Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign Relations. 4 years earlier, he had run for President of the United States, and he picked the senator that was most left-wing of all the Republicans, which was Senator Richard Schweiker from Pennsylvania. And of course, when he runs for president this time, he picks a man that's skull and bones, and it was Cord Meyer, who came from one of those secret societies out of Yale, that was his handler. So you've got the tie of the same secret societies from the Yale campus. And then you start looking over his appointees, and he's got them for the Department of Commerce, Malcolm Baldrige, and you've got different members occupying important positions. He appointed Jeane Kirkpatrick to be ambassador to the United Nations. And most conservatives think how wonderful and applaud her and think she's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And of course, she was on the letterhead of the Industrial League for Democracy right up until their sponsoring, including their sponsoring of Tom Hayden's SDS. And then he came along that same year, in 1982, 2 years later, I ran for Congress and won a contested primary, went back to D.C. at an invitation of the White House that invited en masse winners of the various primaries. And the position then was that no congressional candidate would get money that opposed Ronald Reagan, or pointed out the lack of transparency, that he was giving the country the largest tax increase in American history. And so the invitation to we congressional people that won the nomination was that we'd be given introductions to some lobbyists and cabinet people and have some information we could take back to use for the general election. But instead, they put us in the East Room of the White House, stood up on a platform, and we were to applaud like seals, like most of them did. And he was taking credit for cutting the tax budget when he gave the largest tax increase in American history. And of course, he started sending wheat to the Soviet Union, and it was Americans were getting the shafts. He did an executive order which transferred a steel plant to communist China, signed by George Shultz, who used to be a president of the Council on Foreign Relations. But Ronald Reagan is not who conservatives say he is. His words, if you take his words and put it on paper, they're easy to nod and agree and shake your head yes with. But he was the one that advanced a lot of evil things. You look at the drugs, the drugs from the Contras into the United States. You look at the transfer of technology to deindustrialize the United States by transferring, kicking off with a steel mill to communist China. And of course, he had supported Mao in communist China. So all of the puzzle fits together that Ronald Wilson Reagan was a control-E of the establishment. You look at the fact that Dr. Armand Hammer sponsored a $1,000 plate dinner for him in Century City. And you'd see later that Dr. Hammer, the same one that supported Al Gore and his son Al Gore Jr., were put on the Occidental, the oil board of directors. And Ronald Reagan gave Occidental the exclusive right to go into Libya when Libya was off limits for all kinds of aid and trade because of the shooting down of the airliner going back decades ago. But Ronald Reagan never ceased to push for a world government. And when you look at his history from the time he was with the outright Communist Front organizations to the time he was cooperating with the FBI and the time when he was handled by Cord Meyer, to the times he joined the United World Federalists, to the times he appointed Skull and Bones that ran his administration and cabinet. He is not a conservative in any way, shape, or form in any definition that I know of. In fact, he was the one that did the first amnesty for the illegal invasions, pushing towards this North American Union. When Solzhenitsyn was wanting access to the White House, he put his arm out and said, no, we don't want you here. And at the same time, he was inviting the Hollywood crew that had just done the movie Reds, celebrating John Reed and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But any analysis from an honest researcher has to say Ronald Wilson Reagan was not on our side. In fact, he had put the normal resistance, it's usually the Republicans that are considered more constitutional or more against world government. It's not the case. You go back 20 years before he ran in 1940 when Wendell Willkie ran for president. He was the one that wrote the book One World, and it was ghostwritten by Fels Barnes, who was a communist. But this is where the Republicans never seem to have a person that grows up in their midst from a conservative basis. It's always a former Democrat. It's always the huge Wall Street bankers that promote and mold the candidates. And virtually all of them are members of either a secret society or the Council on Foreign Relations, a trilateralist, or a member of the Bilderberg Society. I think of one or two other things I might. When he appointed George Bush, who was a member of Skull and Bones, that's where Agenda 21 came from. Outside of Reagan's doing the regionalizing as governor, he appointed George Bush as head of the United Nations. And when George Bush was ambassador to the United Nations, he pushed a thing called Mundialization. And that what that had to do was the local cities could join, and they would sing the Parliament of Man, and they'd raise the UN flag alongside their city hall and give a portion of their money towards world government or the United Nations. Now, this is our George Bush Sr., exactly who Ronald Reagan appointed. And the affinity there is that Ronald Reagan was for 13 years on the letterhead of the United World Federalists, run by a member from the secret societies of which George Bush was a member. Now, when Ronald Reagan was president, again, he accused Jimmy Carter of having too many members of the CFR and Trilateral Commission. But when we look at Ronald Reagan's cabinet, member after member, whether it's Caspar Weinberger or William Casey, of the head of the CIA, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, just filled his cabinet. So the guy lied to you just outright. And at the same time, you'll find that the Democrats are lied to too. The Democrats, the unions are out there screaming against Ronald Reagan, and you'll find that the union bosses, heads, were members of the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations. I can go down the list of them from I.W. Abel to the head of the CIA, the garment workers, the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland. There's a dozen big unions down there that were bought out. They're having a good time. They're in the Riviera. They're having a grand time while you're stuck with union wages. And if you're a productive individual, you can't get out of the molasses. You're like the tar baby or something, getting stuck. Which the multinationals, you'll find that most of the multinationals on here, they've got those in defense. You got the Federal Reserve with Chase Manhattan Bank and Morgan Guarantee and Chemical. All those are directors, and all those with the letters after them are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. We find the same thing with the oil companies, and of course the news media. We got the New York Times, the three networks, Time Magazine. It was Henry Luce, who was a member of Skull and Bones. He was very effective. In fact, there is a committee that I'd like to warn you about. It's called the Clare Boothe Luce Organization. And you'll find so-called conservative women in this particular group. You'll find the Ann Coulters, the Michelle Malkin, you see on Fox News, and the other people belong to the Clare Boothe Luce Foundation, or they're advisors to, and they get perks from that organization. It is a skull and bones organization, and what you'll find from these people in their books, they never mention the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, or anything about the Federal Reserve. It's a scam. It's a left-right Hegelian situation. It's like if you want to control a horse, you need a rein on the left and a rein on the right to get going. And if you want to get it going, you put the spurs into the sides. But you can control which way that goes. So they control both sides. Or a sail ship that's tacking from San Francisco to Japan. They don't care which way the wind's blowing as long as it's blowing. If order out of chaos. As long as it's blowing, they can tack back and forth and to get to their destination. And right now, their destination is, they've gotten so far that they're heavily involved in the eugenics aspect of their policies, which means they're on their culling of the world's population. And whether you're talking the chemtrails, whether you're talking the Ebolas, whether you're talking the GMOs, whether you're talking the fluoride, whether you're talking the phony wars without any constitutional approval, it's all going on. So we've got the chaos, and the plan is determined to eliminate the population down to some 500 million people, according to the Georgia Guidestones and the Club of Rome and the people that make the decisions. And I encourage you to realize that Ronald Wilson Reagan is not, was not, nor has ever been a conservative. He has been a puppet of the masters, puppeteers, and that's consider the source. It's the same as people using Ronald Reagan as an icon that come out and talk about our democracy all the time when the country is a republic. Everybody pledges allegiance to the Republic of the United States. But as often as that lie is put out there and repeated, that's a damn lie. And the fact that Ronald Reagan is conservative is a damn lie. The fact that the global warming is going to sink us all is a damn lie. And you got to shake yourself out of the cult of people across the political spectrum and start thinking for yourself, because you're going to need to save yourself, because the move is on to kill you, literally. Yeah, I'm talking about some of Ronald Reagan's appointments again. He appointed George Bush from Skull and Bones. He appointed George Shultz as Secretary of State. He knew about George Shultz. And Ronald Reagan, the great free enterpriser that you think that he is, well, George Shultz, under Richard Nixon, was in charge of wage and price controls. George Shultz was a head of the Council on Foreign Relations. George Shultz, as Secretary of State, signed the executive order that transferred the steel plant to communist China in the early 1980s when the United States was not doing so good. These appointments continued throughout his life. His connection with Arm& Hammer was intimate, and those are just the communists, but it was the multinationals. You've got to remember always that communism is not the people in the street trying to overthrow the banking establishment. Communism is a tool of the banking establishment used to enslave you and to centralize power so that they can control and build their world government. It's exactly that. In comparing the street communist to who really funds them, I think Saul Alinsky would be a good example. Saul Alinsky came from the University of Chicago. It was built by Marshall Field and the Rockefeller family. And that's where Saul Alinsky came from. In fact, Marshall Field, the third or fourth, I think it was, not only financed Saul Alinsky, but was one of his directors. So if you think that Saul Alinsky is out there fighting against power, he's not. He's centralizing power for the benefit of his sponsors, the Rockefellers and the other billionaires. We see this every place. The organization Common Cause, which is one of the most powerful lobbies in the country, it's in some 34 states, was founded by the Rockefeller family, Chase Manhattan Bank, and IBM, and other multinationals. And in California, it's called California Forward. Leon Panetta, who had been head of the CIA and Department of Defense, co-chaired this Rockefeller outfit. And this is decades later, after he had campaigned for Nelson Rockefeller in the early 1960s, because Nelson Rockefeller published his book, The New Federalism, which advocated a top-down administration, the same as the book Philip Drew Administrator, that was written by Colonel House, calling for a North American Union. And if you look at both of those plans, whether the plan from Philip Drew Administrator or from Nelson Rockefeller's New Federalism, which brings you right up into Agenda 21, which was George Bush's Mundialization, which got more sophisticated later. Then you go to the Iron Mountain Report, which was McGeorge Bundy, Skull and Bones, advocating that ecology and climate control be used to create a national purpose, something as effective as war for controlling people. And when you look at the book that advocates Agenda 21, they want to control everything from what you eat, where you go, how you travel, who you vote for, etc. So the total domination is including the killing and the concentration of power and the stealing of what you have left. There isn't a thing they're not going to take from you, including your life and that of your family.